Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Observable Flutter. I'm your host, Craig Labenz, and today we are going to be exploring the home widget package and all of the finishing touches, all of the spit and polish that can put on your Flutter app to help it feel like the true native iOS or Android app that it is. So I'm pretty excited to get into this. I think these are kind of that, I'm a big believer in the 80-20 rule, where the first 20% of your effort gets you 80% of the way there. And then it's all of those final details to see to, that last 20% of result that takes the final 80% of effort. And the home widget package, I think, really expedites a part of that. So I'm pretty excited to explore this. Do recall, folks, that this is the Flutter community, and we are all here to treat each other great, learn some cool tech, and then get back to our lives. So let's do that. Today's guest is the author of the home widget package. It would be inappropriate to have anyone else on to discuss it. So Anton Borries, he's worked with folks from Google before. I'll let him explain some of that in just a second when Anton introduces himself. So Anton, welcome to Observable Flutter. Would you like to say a few words?
Hello. Yes, hi, I'm Anton. I'm based in Hamburg in Germany. I work at 1,5. And as you mentioned, I'm doing the home widget package.
Yeah, exciting. I'm glad that you. I'm glad that we're here talking about this. So I teased a little bit a second ago that you had worked with some folks from Google before on this, specifically from the Flutter team. Can you share a little bit about that story and how it culminated in that big code lab at IO Connect? Am I remembering that correctly?
I'm not sure it was at IO Connect. It was definitely Code Lab. So I started with home widget I think now 4 years ago almost. When this went along, and then I did other things because time, and then one day Leah, back when she was still at Google, approached me because she wanted to do a code lab on it and had an idea of rendering Flutter widgets through home widget, which I guess we'll talk about in a minute as well. And then through that whole journey, there was the code lab on the Google side. Home widget was package of the week as well, which is a great video series I can recommend, really. And then through this, I got more involved in the Flutter community, went to a lot of conferences, and then really enjoy that part of the whole Flutter community.
Great. I was just listening to you and trying to edit this setting so we could get socials up. And then I realized that my social Blue Sky still shows before I added my domain. So I'll worry about that in a second. Okay, yeah. So you had, you've built out this package and worked with Leah on it a bit. Obviously, she's over at Flutterflow now, and we miss Leah dearly. But Flutterflow is a great place for her as well. And there's some great questions in the chat that I think are the appropriate place to start here. Where is the chat? How do you computer? Oh, Flutter forward. Yes. So Eric, I was saying to you a second ago, Anton, that Eric helped Leah present it, but I guess you only talked with Leah, but Eric was also very heavily involved. So let's start from the absolute bare bones beginning here. Olamify NG asks, what is the home widget for? So what are we even talking about?
Yes, so I realized quite soon that it's really hard to talk about home widget and home screen widgets in the Flutter context without getting super confusing, because everything is a widget except home widget, I suppose. So home screen widgets, you can really imagine as these helpers on your home screen. So I think really good examples is always like if you have your weather app that can show multiple, like the weather forecast for a couple of days, On Android, the clock is technically a home screen widget. So basically everything you can place on your home screen widget, on your home screen, that is not just an app icon. And so this is really, really helpful because you can do a lot more stuff with the home screen widget and see a lot more information of your app than you can convey through the app symbol alone. And then in the last year or so, I think it's gotten more and more important also with product owners. I feel to have home screen widgets because they got like a lot more serious since Apple made them also interactive. So I think another really nice example for home screen widgets is like to-do lists, for example, that you can see like your recent to-do list, like your top 5 next to-dos, and then you can just tick them off directly on the home screen widget without having to go into the app to actually complete the task.
Yeah, interesting. I actually did not know that they had become interactive. That's cool. And what was your reaction when you saw that feature announced and you, I'm sure, immediately understood, you had a lot of blanks to fill in. What will the function name be that I have to implement? But like you immediately understood the expansion of the complexity of your package when you saw that. What were you thinking?
The good thing in that way was basically that on Android, as far as I can tell, since always home screen widgets have been interactive.
Oh,
And
okay. So you
so
were prepared.
there was everything in place, and on Android, home widget was already supporting interactivity. And it then was just the course of watching WWDC each year and seeing, are they going to make home screen widgets on iOS interactive this year? No. Next year, the same question again. And then I think it was in what was it? I think 22, I think they made the home screen, or 20, or actually might have even been last year. I think it may have been only last year with iOS 17 that they made it interactive. And then it was clear for me that, okay, now I have to support it, which was a bit of a challenge because my background before I did Flutter was on the Android side, so I always felt a bit more familiar with these concepts. But got it working, and it's working super nicely. And I think the solution I came up with is actually super great because you can actually now call Dart code through home widget. So especially if you have a home screen widget for both platforms, you can call the Dart code from both sides. Because I guess we should tell this to everybody who gets excited to just say, okay, let's build home screen widgets with Flutter. It's not super easy to do it with Flutter directly because both platforms have a lot of limitations around home screen widgets. So in terms of how big can they be, in terms of really like size on disk, what can you actually display on this? So it's not possible, unfortunately, to have a Flutter app really running inside of a home screen widget. And like update intervals, it's really unclear how often you can update a widget. Some people say like once every 15 minutes, but then again, you can do it quicker, but also you don't know whether they updated the widget for you or not. So it's really not ideal, and you have to do a bit of native code. But still, I think that as much Flutter and Dart code you can use, the better it is.
So you said it's tricky to do this with Flutter. And do you mean that is even with the package, or if someone were to try to do it without the package?
I mean, you can totally do it without the package. So in the end, the widgets, you have to think about them as they are bundled really as like separate to your app, like an app inside your app. So on iOS, for example, it's really a separate target you have to completely work with. And you have to unfortunately do these things on the native side in native configurations. This is just the limitations that the operating systems have for these. What home widget supports, though, is that really that it simplifies the way that you can send data from your app to the widgets, that you can trigger updates of the widget from Flutter. And then also I wrote a lot of documentation to really like point you to the direction where do I have to click in Android Studio to make certain things work, or hopefully work. Because I think in the end, it's all doable, and it always sounds a bit scary to do. Oh no, I have to go into Android Studio, or even worse, into Xcode, and do some stuff on the native side. But I really think it's, like you mentioned, it's worth it for the benefits that it brings your product, your users. And I guess we'll do some live coding later as well. I think it sounds scary, but it's not actually that scary. And I personally think it's also like great to still like look at, okay, like how does this work on the native side of things, like in Swift UI, in Android with Jetpack, and then also like learn to love hot reload again, like because you will lose some benefits while developing a home screen widget, and so when you get back to the Flutter side of things and you can use hot reload again, this is then you fell in love with hot reload just like the first time.
All right, I'm super excited to see this come together, and I've got a lot of questions that I think are probably just, they're only going to be answered by the actual code. So it is potentially time to start building something out. I know you've got your screen shared here. Is there anything else you'd like to say, or any other setup that is maybe important to share before we start building?
No, so maybe quickly, because I mentioned it earlier a bit about render Flutter widgets, because I think this is quite the cool thing that Leah initially came up and then we worked on together, is that, as I mentioned, you can't display everything inside of the home screen widget. So you can only use certain components, certain features from the native side of things. One thing you can use, however, is images. And so what Home Widget offers is that you can pass any Flutter widget to Home Widget, and then Home Widget take a screenshot of that widget and send that to the native site. And then it says you, the documentation says you what you need to do in order to display then this image on the home screen widget. So if you have like a super fancy Flutter widget you build, you can then use that screenshot of this to display on the home screen widget. And I think this helps a lot to really get started like super quickly as well.
Yeah. And one of the, so that was my understanding of how it had always worked, which is, of course, a little, I can't imagine off the top of my head exactly how that would mesh with an interactive widget, but I'm sure we'll see that as we go. So that's one question that is already, is brewing in the back of my mind, or I guess the front of my mind. The other question, and this is, I think, just a function of how both Android and the folks at Apple for iOS design the API. But from a Flutter perspective, right, everything is declarative. We just have, unless there's a multi-window situation, right, you just have one widget tree, one main method, one entry point, and that declarative loop is just going at all times. And then anytime you need something, this feels imperative to me, right? The operating system, the host platform comes in and is like, hey, got a home widget for me? And it's like, maybe the app's not even running when that happens, so we're registering some other entry point in the background. And I'm curious what that actually looks like in practice. So those are the two biggest questions that I have that I'd really like to see, or I'd like to explore. I do have some starred questions here. So some have been answered. Does Home Widget need native code? Certainly does. And I think we're going to see some of that. A question about performance, which let's kind of cue, unless it's a very simple answer, we can queue this up for when we're looking at the code. But this is a good question that we should get to at some point. And Yeah, a handful of folks also asking about Flutter in production. So that's an event that will be next week. It's a live stream. So there will be a live Q&A after the event for about 30 minutes or something. And then, but mainly Flutter in production is, the Flutter team trying to tell a story about how Flutter is ready for production apps of any size. So we hope you'll tune in. Okay, but enough about that.
And try to find if you find an extended or a remote version. So I think a lot of the Flutter meetups are doing live streams. So there will be, for example, in Hamburg, there will be one. So for those in the north of Germany, should come to Flutter Hamburg next week as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's those viewing parties, I think, will be pretty fun. Yeah, I'm always impressed by the Flutter community's ability to self-organize, dozens, 100, however many viewing parties all around the world. It's pretty darn cool. So, okay, let's start building. So your screen is here, and we are looking at our old friend.
App.
Yeah.
Yes. So I thought let's use this example. I like the counter app as an example because most people know these example apps. And so let's first set us the goal that we have our counter widget and we can see what our current count or the last count is on a home screen widget on Android. So it's basically everything is still the same. I did a bit that the counter is nullable here and like a variable here. But what we can do first, because we are talking to home widget on platform channels, so everything is a bit asynchronous. So we make that method asynchronous. And as I said earlier, is home widget handles the data transfer, because you have to think of your app lives here, and then the home screen widget is like a more or less a second app. It's like a separate process. So home widget offers a way to really have a nice data transfer between the widget and the app. So let's see, we can say that our counter value, we can say await, and then from home widget, by the way, for completeness sakes, what you need to do, Flutter package, you add the package to your dependencies. And then we can say get our widget data, and then we use our counter. This is like a key that we will then be reusing on the native side again. And then what we also can do, we can say we give it a default value that if there's no widget data yet saved, or the user deleted all the data, then we use 0. Then we can say our new value, that should be our counter value. Let's use the exclamation point in this case, and we'll add 1. And then, Copilot is already helping me out. Really great.
Thanks, Copilot.
So we can say save. So we do get widget data to get data that's stored with home widget, and we use save widget data to save widget, to save data to the widget. And then we can say update widget. And here Copilot is not as helpful. And we use the name. And let's call this observable widget. And where we'll need to reuse this name, and we'll explain a bit later, because we have to remember this name on the native side.
Okay, so I have a couple of questions. You said that counter is a string that we're going to reuse on the native side. So there's no setup needed here. There's no like other declaration file or config or anything where you establish counter. Like you could do ASDF, some random string here. You then just have to remember it on the native side. That's all.
Yes. So the way this works is under the hood, home widget uses shared preferences on Android and user defaults on iOS, which is the same technology that the shared preferences package, for example, also uses. So it's a really simple key value storage. And this is a straightforward thing that you can just use any string. I think it's a string. Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
If I can do it with any of, no, it's a string.
Yeah. Okay. So you have. Does the home widget package make use of Pigeon, or did you just write these method channels yourself? I'm guessing.
Yes, I'm writing them myself because at least when I started with home widget, Pigeon was. I'm not sure if Pigeon was even around or if it was like super experimental and like with a
Okay.
yeah don't really use this yet. And I'm also not sure. Back then, at least, it was that I think Pigeon wasn't bidirectional. I think you couldn't. I think you can only use method channels, but no event channels. And home widget uses both. So
I see. Okay.
so
All
right
right.
now
So
I did the method channels myself. Yeah.
got it. So first you're saving data. So I'm guessing like get widget data and save widget data, they are not actually using any kind of platform channels. They're just saving to local to shared preferences. And then is that yes or no?
I mean, it's a no because so technically, even if you use the shared preference package, they use method channels to
Oh,
talk with the native
true.
site. I mean, I'm not sure if
Yeah.
they might be migrated to FFI, but so it's on the native side of things. But I'm also using like my own implementation of it to have really a separation of so that the widget data is not like mixed with other shared preferences you might have stored.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. All right. That super makes sense. Yeah. So you didn't know but you did write them as you just said. Okay. So you've got platform channel invocations here, but they're actually not, they're closer to shared preferences. Maybe you're adding some namespaces or something. You're just writing data that will be used later. And then I'm guessing update widget is poking the native side and saying, hey, run the method. And then the method has to exist on the native side.
Yes. So it's not really a method that needs to exist on the native side. So basically, both on Android and iOS, there are basically managers for these home screen widgets. And what home widget under the hood does for update widget is says to the operating system, "Hey, operating system, there's new data available for this widget, observable widget, or there are other ways to define these." And basically, and this is the thing that I mentioned earlier, is you'll never know, and the operating system doesn't let you know if it actually updated the widget. So it might be that you say, yeah, please update this widget, and the operating system says, yes, will do, but never actually does.
Okay, so it's UDP, not TCP.
Yeah, basically.
Okay, fire and forget. All right, cool. So we've called these methods. What do we do next?
Now we go to the. I mean, we can, I guess, use auto restart. So right now, I'll need to. I added a new channel. Added this new, so we have to run this one time fresh because the app didn't know about home widget yet. So what we expect, or at least I expect, is that when we run it the first time, it should count up from 0, and then if we hot restart it, it should be, I guess, if we move this, make it null first, then the second time we count, we should actually start with the count that we had. So
There's something upset here.
what?
We wouldn't be doing it live if we didn't have an error. So
yes, so it's complaining that it doesn't have this widget that it can't update. So it will complain if it can't find a widget to update.
all right.
So I suppose if
That's
we
one way to know
comment this out,
yeah, one way to know that it tried to do something.
that is true. Okay. So you can see the data is counting up, and then if we do a hot restart, you can see we continue the count, so the value is really stored.
It's been persisted. Nice.
So let's get into the native side. And we'll need to do a couple of things first. So we'll start by adding a dependency on glance or Jetpack glance, which is basically, so Jetpack is everything with declarative UI on Android. So Jetpack Compose, for example. And then glance is the package in Android that is used for home screen widgets. So even as a native Android developer, you can't just use exactly the same codes and components on a home screen widget that you can do in your other app. So we'll need this as a dependency. So it's the build Gradle file of the app, and then we'll add a dependency on glance. And then we'll need more things because, yay, Android need to have a build feature enabled.
I thought this declaration was just going to be the word build feature with no
Yeah.
no
Yes,
blocks.
please build my
Wow,
feature.
okay.
That would be really nice. And then I'm pretty sure if we do this, it will fail. Oh. I don't want to update Gradle right now. Let me cheat a bit and actually.
Cheating is the only way to live. So well, I was going to ask. I'll just chit chat while you work on this. So just ignore me if I'm distracting.
Build finished.
Oh, it worked.
It worked. I think.
Oh, great. So what was the issue?
I think it was this compose option thing that we had to add as well.
This is why everyone loves Gradle files so much.
Yeah, it's really fun.
This is just the best.
I did a workshop at the Dev Fest in London recently, and somebody was using Gradle 2, and let's just say I have to look into supporting Gradle 2 with Home Widget
Oh boy.
as well.
Oh boy. Randall said it would be nice if the boilerplates could be automated, perhaps with an installable bin tool. That sounds like an incredibly challenging engineering task in itself.
It's so this got bumped up my internal roadmap a lot recently because as you'll soon see, we'll have to create a bit more boilerplate even. But I believe a lot of these things could be automated with Mason bricks. So I'm not sure if you had Felix yet on the show to talk about Mason.
Oh yeah, he was over 2 years ago, probably an early guest.
Yeah. So yeah, basically Mason is like a tool to automate boilerplates. I would say on a really high level, it can do a lot more than this. But it's really great for generating boilerplates. But then again, how good it would be to figure out which of these things you'll need based on your Gradle version remains probably to be seen. But yeah, definitely.
And the hard part is like if they already have the compose options block with other things in it, then you only need to add the key, and like, it's just, oh goodness, what a nightmare. Very, very hard. I think anytime you have to open the Gradle file, it's just like, this isn't why I went into this career. Okay, so
Yes. So
the
Compose is
thing is
ready.
building
We
now. Yeah.
have our dependencies. So once again, as I mentioned, oftentimes doing something on the native sites makes you really appreciate stuff on Flutter. So just compare this whole setup at Nightmare to running pub-ed.
Good, great point. Praise be.
Yes. So next up, we'll need a configuration file, which is a resource XML file. And we can just call this configuration. And then we have really confusing UI. So
I've not helped you by requesting the biggest font you've ever used.
So we are having an app widget provider. And so this is, for example, the initial layout before the operating system has done anything with it. And there, the Android, they provide like a glance default loading layout, which is like just a loading spinner on the middle of the screen, which they propose in their documentation to use. And I feel like that makes a lot of sense. You can define stuff like your minimum and maximum heights. So because on Android home screen widgets, at least for most launches I know, they are fully resizable. And like you can freeform them. Like on iOS, you have like 4 or 5 different sizes you can choose from. But on Android, we'll soon see, you can drag them around and resize them how you want.
Whoa.
And this way you can restrict this a bit in terms of like making sure that your layout actually would work.
Isn't totally bonkers.
Yeah. Let's see if I'm not sure which more potential values are required, but I'm sure it will let us know. But this is the configuration file, and this is like a good example of what would be like super easily be simplified and be possible with Mason, for example, to automate adding this file.
Yep.
And so now we go into our first Kotlin file. And this is now our app widget. And so what the app widget is basically the definition of the view. So this should extend the glance app widget. And then
I remember when we added that.
The glance app. Oh, sorry. The glance app widget. This is coming from glance. Are you meant when we added glance or when we added this class?
I was just being silly. I said I remember when we added that. You're good.
And so we need to override a function called provide glance, which will return basically the compose version of a widget tree. So we can say provide content, and then we can say this is our glance content with context and something called current state. And we can write us a composable function called glance content, which will take in context and our current state. And here the first time home widget comes around again with the home widget glance state. So what you mentioned earlier about like you can potentially have multiple widgets on the home screen of different kinds, different apps or same app can have multiple different widgets. And basically what happens is that whenever the operating system feels like it, or you can kindly request the operating system to update the widget, the operating system will call this provide glance method with a new so-called state. And the funny thing about glance is still relatively fresh in the stable version. And before 1.0, it was really, or there was not really that much documentation on the official Android doc site. Or even worse, there was outdated documentation. And it was really unclear, okay, what do I actually need to do in order to have a nice state? And so, or what actually needs to go into the state. However, after like some Stack Overflow searches, I finally found the solution and was able to wrap this quite nicely into Home Widget. That Home Widget can take care of all the state handling and give you with an object that you can actually use and use your data that you send there from Flutter. So we have this Home Widget glance state, and we'll need to override something called the state definition. And we'll have our Home Widget glance state definition.
Yeah, there is a fair amount of native code to write here.
Mr. Constructor. So, but now we are in this glance content, which you can think about basically as your build method coming from the Flutter side of things. So as I mentioned earlier, I think I managed a nice solution to get to your widget data that you send through Flutter in this Home Widget glance state. And the thing is that on this current state, you have now a variable called preferences. And so these preferences are basically the shared preferences that Home Widget is saving data into. So we can say our counter, can say from our preferences, get an int. And this here is our counter key that we defined or used in here.
Okay, all right.
So basically we store in Flutter, we store and get data with the key counter. And then in our build method, more or less, we get this with the counter variable, and we'll need to provide it a default value here as well. And then we can say, notice that there's no return. I don't know why in Kotlin there doesn't need to be a return in here. But basically the last statement is treated as a return, which
there's a fair amount
coming
of
from
do that.
Flutter, Flutter feels a bit weird though.
Yeah, I personally not really a fan of the push for across all languages to like remove every single possible bit of like technically you don't need it typing. It's like, yeah, but it does tell me stuff and I can imagine that it's there, yes, but just can I have the return keyword? I don't know. Maybe I'm a dinosaur, but that's my thinking on it. But yeah, Randall, of course, with the Perl update, Perl does that as well. I know a lot of languages do. It's not my favorite anytime I see it. But maybe I'm just a dinosaur.
So I went ahead and write a bit of Jetpack Compose code. And it's really weird to write like Dart code or Flutter code and then directly afterwards write Compose code, because it's super similar. So basically a box is the equivalent of a container, and then you have a column as well, but you don't define your children with like a children and then a list. It's like this block, and then bonus points if you
mhm.
do the same thing in SwiftUI at the same time. So you have another language to care about. And
Yeah, so that would be what, the H stack in
yeah,
SwiftUI?
it's the HStack and VStack. Yes. So
Oh, V stack, right? I can't horizontal, vertical, left, right. My brain's not good at those things.
yes. We are almost done with native code. Almost. We'll need, so this is basically our app widget. This defines what is actually in the home screen widget. But the operating system doesn't talk to an app widget directly, but talks.
Yeah, some entry point.
It talks to a so-called receiver.
Mm.
And so this one, this will be our receiver, and we call this one observable widget. And this is the name that, if we uncomment this line again, will be used here again. So with the name, you talk to the receiver. There are different options. If you can, for example, define different names depending on how you name things. You can define different names for your Android widget and your iOS widget. Also on Android, it uses like reflection to find the receiver based on this name. So you have to make sure that you provide the correct package, because Kotlin is really close to Java, and so you have like packages that are really, really important. You can also define this to home widget to make updating easier. And so once again, so this is the receiver, and this needs to be of a special kind in order to work with the home widget glance state. But home widget provides you what you need. So you need to extend the home widget glance widget receiver, and then we can give it our observable app widget that we defined earlier. And then we are good. So what happens is basically when the operating system says, okay, I want to add a home screen widget, it will go to the receiver and say, hey, receiver, I want to add a new widget of your kind to the home screen. And then the receiver will say, here you go, here's my observable app widget. It will add this to the home screen. And then when there are updates for the app widget, the receiver will say, okay, I'm responsible for this instance of the widget. And I will take this update that you requested and pass this along to the app widget.
All right. Okay. All right. Feels like we've almost plugged in all the wires here.
Almost. So what we now need to do is basically tell our app, hey, app, we have this receiver that can handle home screen widgets. So we have to go into our manifest. And then in our, so what I told earlier, it basically lives next to your app. So it lives next to the activity. The activity is what launches the Flutter view. So we'll have a receiver, which is our observable widget. And we need to export this, because otherwise Android will complain. And then some intense filters. And this is an app.
All right, and that string you just typed, there's nothing there about your names or your app path.
This
is
is
that always exactly that?
Yes, at least this is what I have in my notes. I hope it is actually what needs to be in there. And then the thing that we need to, that is coming from us, is basically so this one, this wasn't from us, but what we need to say is basically our resource, and this is where we started when we entered the native site, is basically we defined this XML configuration file for the sizing. This one we basically we tell it. So the steps needed, let's do like a run through this. You'll need a dependency on glance to be able to use glance.
Okay.
Because we could do everything in XML layouts, but I don't think anybody would want this. We'll need a configuration XML file. We'll need our widget that is responsible for defining how things should look, like with our build method, more or less. We'll need a receiver to have the operating system send stuff to and say, please receive this update and handle this update. And then we have to tie basically everything together in the manifest.
All
And
right.
in theory, if we run the app, we should.
It just might work.
It may work.
What are our betting odds here that it's going to work?
So our app is still running. This is good.
Yeah, great start.
And
much better than if it
still
wasn't.
count. It still remembers where we were. And also notice I commented this line again in, and it didn't crash yet.
Yep.
So we still can count. So let's go. So turn the device off. Let's go to the home screen. Long press, widgets, and we see our home widget workshop.
Okay.
And by the way, if you, all of the stuff, the preview image that's here, the name here, these are all things you can define in this XML configuration file.
Okay.
Because basically this is where the operating system will look into, okay, which widgets do I have? So we long press, and it's really, really tiny.
Yeah.
But I mean, I'm not sure if you can see it. I can see
it
that
says 11, right?
It says 11 on it. So
yeah.
If we go back to our app, it says also true.
Now, I distinctly recall you setting a minimum size of 100 by 100 digital pixels.
Yes, but this is wait, let me. This is you see this outline around this? This is 100 by 100. But we can go into the widget again, and so it's,
I mean, I don't know. I ship it. I think this is good.
Ship it. Looks nice. It's exactly what our designer wanted. So I think technically this has basically the
yeah, that's the background.
Fill max size. That sounds good.
Ray is wondering if it's fill content as well. I don't know much about Compose, so I'm used.
I think it's fill max size is basically what was fill content in the XML days, or maybe not.
Well, it still says 11, so it didn't update.
It still says 11. That is.
You may be suffering from the restart. Yeah, the OS will get around to it when it gets around to it problem.
Maybe it. Oh, it says 14 now.
Ah, there you go.
And fills the. I'm wondering.
Another version the designer will be happy with.
Yes. I'm not sure why it's not updating. Maybe. You know why it's not updating and didn't complain? Because it didn't save in VS Code. So let's then do the let's figure out what the modifier is to, or is it alignment? Like, what's the vertical alignment?
So yeah, while you're doing that, so it's the text is smaller than the smallest size, but the actual space allocated to the widget itself was not smaller than the minimum size. So now this is a function of actually specifying the layout correctly to use the available size.
Then let's do something like.
Now, I do presume at some point we will be providing the content for the widget via Flutter code.
You mean the render Flutter widget?
This layout that we're doing here, do we have to do this in Compose, or are we able to do this in Flutter?
We have to do it in Compose, unfortunately. So because even these ones, these columns and boxes, they are not from the regular Jetpack Compose. They are from Glance.
Interesting.
Because so if you like, technically, as far as I know, Glance is also just translating the Compose widgets into what's in the XML world were called remote views. And it really is like a super, super tiny subset of available widgets, like text, vertical layouts, horizontal layouts, stacks, I believe. These are
interesting.
Basically what's available.
So how does this mix with the thing that we talked about earlier, where Flutter code would submit a widget and take a picture of it and then use that? How does this all fit together?
Yes. Let's first verify that now it actually works. So the alignment apparently didn't work, but it's now saying 17. Can you see this?
I can. It's small, but I can see it. Anyone watching on their phone will just have to trust us.
And 18, 19.
19, yeah, we're cooking.
My guess is that basically it making the column as small as it needs to be, and this didn't really. Maybe we can use the same modifier. Let's. Apparently not. Anyways, I think adding an image is a lot nicer than what we currently try. So we can go back to Flutter. And then let's just use the same method because we have everything else set up here. So for example, we could say our cool widget, and yeah, just rub it in the center widget. Maybe let's see. Let's see when we get back to Compose later. So our we could say let's make this a container. Let's give it some width and some height. So what's your favorite color for material?
Probably orange. I like orange.
Yeah, then let's do like an orange container, and then let's put an icon in there, and then what's dash? Ah, there's Flutter dash. And then, so basically have a container with some color. I can already tell this will be really exactly like our designer wanted us to have something like this.
Yeah, now would be the time to wrap it in a center widget, I think.
Yeah, maybe. Yeah, we can wrap this I guess with the center.
Spare no expense.
There yes. So what we do is we say home widget, render Flutter widget. It needs a widget, and it can be any widget. It doesn't need to be a widget that's in your widget tree.
Okay.
So you can really use any widget you like, and don't need to be in a specific content. And it needs a key, and this key is the same kind of key that we had to use for the counter. So we can say this should be dash as the key. And again, we have to remember this when we want to access this later again.
Okay. Now, when you said the same kind of key, the kind of key was just a string.
Yeah, right. It's a string, and it's the same principle that we use a key to know what's going on.
Yeah. Okay.
So what render Flutter widget does is basically it's creating the render object for this with this widget and capturing it and storing it as an image. And then later, when we access this key again on the native side, we will have it as a path to an image. So this is already everything we'll need. So we'll increment our counter, then we build our beautiful dash widget, and then we call render Flutter widget, and then we still have our update widget afterwards. So don't forget to save this time.
Yeah, that's helpful.
And so what we do is basically we say our path to the image. We say from our preferences, get a string, we call it dash, and if we don't see, switching between the languages, I now need double quotes, obviously.
Yeah, it's not possible.
But no semicolon. So we get the string to our image path, and then is there something? There's no center. Cool. There was a center? There is apparently there is a center in glance. Maybe it's the wrong. Let's worry about this later. So our image path. And so this is syntax from Kotlin to basically check, is this null? And if it isn't, then we have this code block here where we have a variable called it. We can rename it as well, that we know isn't null.
Is not null. Yeah,
it's not null. And so we create a bitmap factory and we say decode our file from it. So we get our file from the path, and then we say our image, and then we say image provider and the bitmap. And then one thing I quite like about what Android does in terms of accessibility is that they really tell you, they give you this, that you need to provide the content description for it, which I think is really nice. Can say just dash. So in theory, this should already be all it took. So while this is building, what we did, create a widget, render the widget,
and then use the image,
show the image. So we have to obviously press the button, and then you can see a really, really tiny dash. So let's see if we can.
That's good. Now, you gave the container. It was actually kind of small numbers. You said like a width of 46 and a height of 23. Maybe those are those dimensions, but I was expecting a little bigger.
I mean, I guess we can just make it like this.
Yeah, there we go. There, now we're talking.
Also, I used this, which might screw us a bit with like image scaling. But we have to stop our app and then run the app again because it doesn't give us things like hot restart.
All right, this is a good question. We've talked about this a bit in the past, but worth revisiting. Why are you using an image? You passed a widget from Flutter, and then you're receiving an image on the Android side. So let's revisit how this works from a super high level.
So basically, we are not allowed by the operating system to actually show Flutter or run Flutter inside of the home screen widgets. And so home widget can take your Flutter widget, take a screenshot of it, store it, and then you basically trick the system by showing this image instead, and this is really, really helpful for a lot of things, to not have to rebuild basically everything.
Yeah, makes
this
sense.
is bigger. We have an overflow voice, which I believe is coming from Flutter.
Yes, definitely. Yeah, that's very, very Flutter. So this is now, you had mentioned that these things could be resized. So that feels kind of tricky to, you can't use a layout builder for this if it can be arbitrarily resized because it's just an image. So how do you get around that?
Yes, I'm wondering, it might be that I can't resize this actually, because I think I missed, or I didn't provide like a specific argument in here.
Oh, okay.
But this is, I guess, a good thing that you can basically, with this, define your sizes. Maybe we just answered this solution to the problem you were just describing. That yes, I suppose in that sense, it's similarly to how you have to be able to handle responsive layouts and different size factors in Flutter as well, because it might be that your user is using it on an Android phone where they can change the sizes of them, or is using an iPad app on Mac OS, for example, and resizes the window.
Yeah.
So on iOS, it's a bit easier because you have really just a subset of, I think, 4 or 5 sizes, and you can define layouts for each of these sizes differently or separately. But yeah, on Android, I'm pretty sure that in this app widget you can get the current size of it, but I would have to look up exactly how you can get the current size.
Okay.
But I would really think that you should be able to have something like a layout builder to know what is your layout and then set stuff accordingly.
So maybe on the Flutter side, you'd have to supply, you just have to have some structured approach to this where you have a few different aspect ratios and sizes that you're explicitly going to have breakpoints on, and you might have to write quite a few different images from the Flutter side, and then you pull out the specific ones that you need on the native side.
By the way, I think I know where this this overflow is coming from, because when a Flutter widget has a default size of 200 by 200, and so if I give it a bigger size, it will be better.
Okay, all right.
And if only we would have run this. So the cool thing now is that now that we have all the native setup that we need, like we show the image in a beautiful way, and we have a perfect design here, is that when we update things after it's running, we can use again our beloved friend. So now it's not overflowing anymore. Nice. And then if we say blue, and we hot reload this, and then like it didn't update automatically because we didn't send a new image, but if we then trigger this again, we now have a blue image.
Very nice. So if you resize it, what happens? I'm curious. And no matter how broken it is, I promise we don't have to actually fix it. I just am curious what will happen.
So I think this one is the one that was missing.
Aha.
So and my theory is that it would still probably fit the whole screen, because what I did here was I give it a fill max size modifier. I guess that content scale is the name for what we all know as fit. So let's just say fill bounds, which is probably the same as fit.cover in Flutter. So I really like that it's all the same but different.
Yeah, because nobody can agree on what to call anything.
Yeah, it's a
Nice.
really skinny dash now.
Yeah.
But now we can resize it actually, and
Oh, there we
we
go.
can see it's. So I
So the
suppose
reason, so the
if we
reason that dash is getting contorted is because you're just rendering one image and then the image is being stretched to whatever aspect ratio the widget is on Android.
yes, and
right?
it says fill bound. So I
Right.
suppose that if we say, I think fit is probably the more reasonable
Better.
approach
Yeah.
here, and
Yeah.
then if we, I guess. Now I've made this now square, so it will work a lot better with the icon. So send a new image. So yeah, so now we can see that
Nice.
it basically fills the whole viewport. Obviously, we should have probably scaled dash accordingly.
Yeah, but it's all right. Nice. So we've sent both specific data and Flutter layout, and that does feel like a complete demo. Obviously, for any real widget, you would combine those two. But that's pretty clearly a thing that you would just do in the a thing that you would do in either the image that you send, where you would, maybe put the counter instead of the dash logo. You would put the value of the counter, or in Jetpack Compose, you'd combine things as needed. Cool.
Yeah. One thing maybe to note with the generating the images. So it depends always a bit, obviously, on your use cases. So there is an issue that, so the way that Flutter or Home Widget captures the widget is through the render objects from .ui. And those can't render the images when the app is not running, unfortunately.
Okay, so there's no background updating of these.
So if it's like fully in the background, for example, if you want to do it through like some interactive element on the widget, you can, through the interactive element, still, for example, count up. But you can't basically have, if you have an image that gets updated with your counter value, that unfortunately is not possible. However, what you can do, it's a lot more work, or not a lot more, but basically that you have the elements fixed, and then you do the compositing of putting the number in relation to the generated image that you do on the native side.
Yeah.
And that would be one way to approach this. Yeah. But really, I believe for a lot of use cases, and if you know, for example, beforehand, like what states will I reach from these interactive elements, you can then still use the render Flutter widget to render your things beforehand.
Makes sense. Cool. So that there are requests in the chat for an interactive, or a demo of an interactive widget. It is okay if you are not prepared to demo that, but what does that take? What does that look like?
I think we should be able to. It sounds more. I'll have to find the correct notes. But
to what extent are your notes the package's documentation?
It's actually so my notes are my notes, or the workshop that I did at several DevFest a couple of weeks ago. So the document, what I noticed to that is parts where the documentation is lacking. But I will hopefully in the Christmas time, when there's time, I may get to update more of these of the actual documentation around the findings I had. But in principle, all the information that I'm showing here is available through the documentation as well.
Gotcha. Cool. Great.
So
yeah,
how much time do we have actually for the interactive stuff?
We could we do it in 20 minutes?
Yes.
Great.
So we'll need a couple of things. The first thing is basically a callback function that the widget can call. So we can say this is our home widget callback, and this takes an optional UI in. And so this UI is something that we can later on the native side we can provide. So basically, when we click on an element, like we can, for example, soon make it that if we click on dash, it actually counts up. We can say basically in that UI, we can say, okay, I clicked on dash, but we could also say a different UI for I clicked on the number to, in this callback, figure out where did the user click and what should I do with it. So
interesting.
What we'll need to do is we make sure that this is known as an entry point for Dart to be called, because this will also work when the app is totally killed, theoretically, because it can spin up a new Flutter engine in the background and call this thing.
Okay.
So, and here we can, let's just copy a lot of this code here. I will remove the whole render widget here, because as I said earlier, this is not really clear, or this is not, we don't always know whether it will be working, because we don't know in what state Flutter is, if it can actually capture widgets right now. But we can still do the same thing. So our callback, basically the same thing, get our widget data, save the widget data, count up.
Yeah, right.
And update the widget. And then, so we have a callback. And then what we'll need to do is basically we'll need to say home widget, register interactivity callback, and we give it our callback. So some important notes on how this callback looks is it basically needs to be an entry point for Dart. So it has to be static and public.
Okay.
But that is basically all of the requirements. So we create our callback function and we register an interactive callback.
All right. And so the actual logic that's going to be executed for this interactivity is back in Dart code. And that I think is certainly preferable to us Flutter developers. Obviously, you must also be able to do it on the native side, because they're not assuming that Flutter exists.
That was the easy and the Flutter part. We'll soon have to get back into the native parts.
Got it.
But there's again like documentation around this, what you'll need to actually do. Because it works in a similar way to the widget itself. So we actually last time we ended in the manifest. This time we start in the manifest. And so we'll need a new receiver. And our receiver is actually coming from home widget. So this is it's confusing because it's the same package prefix as the rest of the app, because it's also my package prefix. But this is actually coming from the package. So you would also, if you would build this, you would also use this background receiver. And again, we need to have it exported so so Android knows about this. And then it needs an intent filter with another action. And this needs to be also exactly needs to be, again, comes from home widget. It's basically the background action, so that the app knows that it can handle this. And then we need service, which is also coming from home widget, which needs to have a permission, and this is now coming at least from Android. So these are all basic things that it's a very helpful hint.
Expected receiver. What did that say?
Yeah.
Expected receiver does not require permission.
Expected receiver does not require permission. It basically gives me a warning line that nothing is needed.
Is wrong.
So
I always, as a kid, I always thought it would be very funny to just call my friends and tell them that, like, I couldn't. I was like, "Hey, I'm busy. I can't like hang out today." And when we had no plans, it was just like a totally random call, like, "Hey, I'm busy today, by the way. Okay, bye." And like that feels like the error message that we just got.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's already it in the manifest. Basically saying, "Hey app, here's this service from here's this service from home widget or from my app that can handle that has this receiver and can handle this intent." This is basically registering this in the app. And then we need to create an action callback. So and here we create us an intent. And this one is it's a home widget background intent. And we get our broadcast, pass in the context, and then we pass in our UI. So we can say, and this can be really any UI string that you want. We can say increment, and then we have the intent, and we send it. So this is an action callback, because you don't just call methods in Glance. You do it via these actions. So we can wrap surround this with a widget. It's so weird. Here they say, by the way, surround with container.
Right, but it's box
And
elsewhere.
it's a box.
Oh,
it's actually a box.
That's funny. What if they just copied the code?
Tell me you copied Flutter without telling me
Exactly.
you copied Flutter, right?
Exactly. That's exactly what I was going to say.
So it's again another modifier. So everything in Glance seems to be modifiers, like the background, setting the background, setting some sizing. It's all done via modifiers. So one of these modifiers is a clickable. And there we can say that we want to run our interactive action. And so basically we say surround the image with a box. And when you click on the box, run the callback of this interactive action.
Okay.
And then our interactive action says on action creates a background intent from home widget, which is of the format that we registered in the manifest before. And then that is fired off. Home widget will be called again on the receiver side of things, knowing that there was this intent fired off. It will take this UI and go back into Flutter and call our callback here. And so in theory, if we run this, we should be able to click on dash and we should see the number go up. And we did not take 20 minutes.
No, this was 11 by my count. Quite good.
So we are at 32. We clicked it and we are at 33.
That was fast. And but it's launching a whole, maybe it's caching it.
Well, it depends. So if there's a Flutter engine running,
it'll use it.
I use that.
Okay.
But for example, what we can do is we can So we had
Cold start
35.
the phone or something. Yeah.
We can basically, so we cleared our app. Our app is not running. It takes a bit longer, but as you
Not
can see,
terrible though.
it's still counted
Yeah.
up.
Nice.
So even if you have users, and we have a lot of these users that are closing all of the apps in the app drawer, even those can still like use the interactive widget.
Dang.
And so
That's pretty cool.
the cool thing is also, given that this thing is called, is we defined the callback in Dart. Sure, on iOS we have to define our layouts in Swift UI, but we have a relatively similar approach. Like the ideas behind how both platforms handles interactive stuff, using like this intent to say basically from the outside, like from the widget, say to the main app, hey, here's something, please handle this. It's relatively similar. Like if we would have done the demo in iOS, it would have taken us around the same amount of time as well to do the integration on iOS, and then we can use the same callback to actually do the logic operation that we want on both Android and iOS.
Cool. Nice. Man, that is pretty neat. And Sai with a pun that I really quite appreciate. You were asking questions about, other bit of functionality, and then at the end, incremental progress indeed, because we just incremented the number from the native side. Well, let me see. I'm going to return to the questions that I have queued up. We may have gotten to almost all of these. Oh, here's an off-topic one that was asked a full hour ago, and I immediately started because I was also interested. And then there was more. There were echoes in the chat requesting that the question be surfaced, but I didn't want to interrupt you. So now's the time. Tell us about your keyboard.
Oh, it's an HHKB Type 2S silent in a Neubauer case. It's not the cherry board at the moment.
Okay. Yeah, my ear is not sharp enough to, it's like, oh, those are brown switches. Oh, those are red. Those are blue. But yeah, I did think that it sounded pleasant.
So yeah, it's Topaz switch. It's not no cherries.
Whoa, man! I've never even heard of that switch type before. A lot of them. All right, so let's see. I'm going to read through these other questions I've starred. Oh yes, this was a super interesting one, and I think this is the last one we didn't already cover, that at least that I starred. So yeah, the question says, what if I want to make a home widget that plays music, for example? Can I do that with home widget?
Playing music directly, I'm not sure whether the systems actually allow like audio playback from it. What should, and really I haven't tried it that myself, be possible is to have like some forms of controls, like to play or pause music. It should be possible that you basically have a pause button on your widget that switches between play or pause and then sends a command to the app again. The thing I'm not 100% sure about is how this, because playing sound obviously requires other native plugins.
Right. Yep.
And especially when the app is in a more backgrounded state, although I suppose for music players, they will be in some kind of foreground.
Yeah.
There may be issues around communicating then from Flutter again or to the native plugin. I think it should be possible. I believe there are widgets that use, for example, also like stuff with Bluetooth to show stuff on there. So it is, as far as I'm aware, possible to talk with plugins again, even from the interactive state. So yeah, technically should. Please try it out and contact me if you have
back.
more questions. Yes.
Yeah. All right. Well, so those are all of the questions that we've received today, which I think brings us to the end. So Anton, thank you so much for this incredible demo. Thank you so much for working on this package. That's a an enormous contribution to the Flutter community. So from everyone, a sincere golf clap. Any final thoughts on your end that you would like to share?
Yeah, no. Check out Home Widget. Let me know if you find it really useful. Let me know, but ideally not as much if you find something really irritating and doesn't work. But yeah, please open issues. Contact me if you have more questions. Always happy to help.
All right, cool. Well, folks, that will do it for us today. So, man, I enjoyed learning a lot about the home widget package and how to set that up and whatnot. I had no idea. I hadn't gone through that code lab that you and Leah put together and that Eric helped her present at Flutter Forward. So I came into this pretty green, which I think was very apparent the whole time. Folks, next week, there's going to be a special stream in relation to Flutter in production. So hopefully you won't be so exhausted of all things Flutter in production that you can't tune in anymore. We're going to have different guests on from some partners and talk about their experience using Flutter in some of the biggest apps in the world and whatnot. I'm looking forward to that. The details are all still being pinned down and solidified and whatnot. So we'll all find out exactly how it ends up looking together next week in exactly, well, 1 week minus 88 minutes. And I'm looking forward to that. I think it'll be really fun. Flutter in production should be super fun. And then I'm going to probably be off until sometime in the new year. So next week will be the final stream of 2024 and maybe even for a little bit of the beginning of 2025. So I hope to see you all there. Anton, thank you so much. And for everyone, happy fluttering.
Bye-bye.